Hello everyone and welcome to Pride and Prejudice screencast for Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Over the coming weeks we will be looking at several chapters of the novel which I think will help you with when preparing for your exams. So let's look at what is going to be in this video. Okay, so today's screencast will focus on the purpose of the opening chapters, closer analysis of Mrs. and Mr. Bennet, and of course the most important quotations from these two chapters according to myself. Okay, so there are many reasons why Austen chose to structure her novel in this particular way. Okay, so I think one of the reasons is to show the neighborhood in which our protagonist lives. Another reason might be to show how ironic, how irony is used in this novel. Okay, you might not agree with this one, but we'll look at it later. Perhaps this to showcase the matriarchy versus the patriarchy in the novel as well, or within that particular household. And of course, it introduces the characters and also their context and the setting. Okay, so we will begin with looking at the neighborhood in which our protagonist lives. Okay, so in this neighborhood, single men are almost object-like. The people, especially the mothers of the ladies, will consider the young men to almost belong to them. Okay, it's almost that immediately when the man moves in, there's this big commotion, and of course we have the narrator telling us that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. So that is obviously very important, that these people in the community believe that obviously this particular man will belong to at least one of them. Okay, we also see that older women, especially of course the mothers of the girls, are seen to be gossipers, and perhaps of course that shows that there's not much else for them to do. Okay, and this is what Mrs. Bennet says: for Mrs. Long has just been here and she told me all about it. And of course that is referring to Mr. Bingley coming to Netherfield. Okay. Also, you can identify that some women view marriage like a competition. And once again, we have a quotation from Mrs. Bennet where she says, Sir William Lucas and Lady Lucas are determined to go, so therefore they of course should visit Mr. Bingley immediately, okay, in order to perhaps compete with them and get there first. Okay. So, moving on to Austen's powerful use of irony. You will really see a lot of this in the novel. It's almost like a process where an opinion is given and then soon it changes. Okay, so you can almost see it's like prejudice itself, okay, where you're prejudiced about something, you have one opinion, and then you figure out the truth, and therefore your opinion changes. Okay, so I think that's what Austen is trying to do here. Okay, so on line 1 you see this particular statement. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of a wife. I've highlighted in red the most important, of course, idea here, that it is the truth, and everybody knows this truth. Okay, so everybody knows this fact that once a single man who of course is very rich, he must want a wife. Okay, in line number 2, however, I see this contradiction. Okay, however, little known the feelings and views of such a man may be on his first entering. So really, this is ironic because of course at first we hear that everyone knows this fact, and yet on line 2 it says, of course, that this particular, or sentence number 2, it says that this man who's going to move into this neighborhood doesn't know the truth. Okay, so really it's not the truth, it's more like an opinion of the families that live there. Okay, so we can see how she used, of course, this particular device, irony, straight away in chapter 1. Okay, so moving on to matriarchy versus patriarchy. Okay, you might not agree with me on this one, but I think that this is a very important point, and of course I would like to talk to you about this a little bit further. I feel that in these two chapters is almost like a power struggle between the lady of the house and of course the man of the house. Okay, Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet. Okay, there kind of seems to be a power shift. Okay, so we can see in chapter 1 that Mr. Bennet is seen to be the head of the house, of course, which of course would be normal since he's the male. Of course, he's the only male in the house, so therefore that would be obviously important. He refuses to go and see Mr. Bingley. Of course, he's teasing Miss Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, and he says when there are 20 suitors, of course, I will visit them all. Okay, so refuses, and we kind of think, okay, he put his foot down, and that's what he's going to do. However, in chapter number 2, Mrs. Bennet is seen, seems to be the most influential within their household. Okay, because really, when Mr. Bennet visited Mr. Bingley early in the morning, he surprised his wife and therefore gave in to her wishes. Okay, I'm not saying that's not a good thing to do. Of course, it is a good thing to do. But we kind of seen that perhaps it's Mrs. Bennet who might be controlling this particular situation here. Okay, and of course, Mr. Bennet says, "I have actually paid the visit. We cannot escape the acquaintance now." Okay, so of course you can see that there is some kind of struggle with it, with the power. Okay, and of course that is uh, the reason why it is so humorous. Now, moving on to characters and their backgrounds. Okay, a lot is revealed in the opening of the novel. Okay, so Mrs. Bennet seems to be very dramatic. Okay, and especially when she says, "You have no compassion of my poor nerves." She's also emotional when she says, "What an excellent father you have, girls." Just previously being obviously scrutinizing him and insulting him. Now she's very emotional because her emotions seem to shift very quickly. She's also artificial because earlier she was talking about Mrs. Long, and of course how she was speaking to her and gossiping with her, but then the minute when she speaks about her nieces, she says she's a selfish, hypocritical woman and I have no opinion of her. Okay, of course it is quite humorous because we can see that she has a very strong opinion of her. Okay, and that is Mrs. Bennet talking about Mrs. Long. We also see more about Mr. Bennet. He's playful, of course. He likes to tease, especially Mrs. Bennet. When he replies, "I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my friends." Okay. Of course, he's good humoured. "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose." When obviously he spoke and told Mrs. Bennet of him going to see Mrs. Or Mr. Bingley. Of course, she may now get cough as much as she chooses, and therefore it will not irritate Mrs. Bennet. Okay, of course, we see a bit about Elizabeth Bennet. Of course, she doesn't speak a lot, but we can identify that she is Mr. Bennet's favorite daughter. Okay, when he kind of says that he must speak about Lizzie more than others. Okay, and he says, "I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie." We also hear about Jane Bennet, okay, where Mrs. Bennet considers her to be the beauty of the house and out of all the sisters, okay, not half so handsome as Jane. Of course, she's speaking about Elizabeth here. And Lady Bennet, where again Mrs. Bennet says that she's very good at humoured, and of course later we will see whether she is good at humoured or not. Okay. Now remember, these are not all of the ideas. So if you have your own opinions, as long as you can back them up with, quotations, then of course you can explain them. You should be fine as well. Okay. So what I think will be the most important quotations, in my opinion, of course, would be the ones that we already looked at, that I've already stated earlier in my screencast. But I feel there are also one more important quotation that I feel that you perhaps should look at and identify. Of course, this is the first one that we looked at already, okay? But this is the one where I would like you to remember as well. So the business of her life, and this is speaking about Mrs. Bennet, the business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news, okay? So Mrs. Bennet, of course, is a very important figure, and therefore you can see that even the narrator tells the reader of the three her favorite things that she likes to do. Okay, first of all, she only cares about getting her daughters married. Okay, then she likes visiting, and of course the gossiping or the news. Okay, so we've come to the end of the screencast, and what I would like you to do now is to say out loud or write down this particular phrase. Okay, I always think it's good to test your knowledge. So what did you learn today? So before this video I knew, and obviously substitute in the dots there whatever you think you knew before this particular screencast, and however now I know, and then state what you kind of learned or revised from this screencast. Okay, and also don't forget to visit my blog. It is obviously gigontite.wordpress.com, and of course there are always more reviews or other more information there. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed it and you found the screencast useful. See you soon.